am so grateful to be welcoming on Alex here to come and join us in talking about treaty and sharing a little bit about what is happening. So I'll pass over to you, Alex, if you'd like to introduce yourself and jump on in.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to join you all. Want to acknowledge that I'm joining from Yagara Terrible Country in Meganjin, also called Brisbane, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And it sounds like this has been an incredible space over a number of days, and yeah, really fortunate to be able to join you and have some conversations about the journey towards treaty with First Peoples in different parts of this continent and what folks can do, no matter your background, where you live, what community or organisation you're part of, to show solidarity. So I have a few slides. I've just requested if it might be possible for me to share my screen so I don't get too off track. Great. Give me 1 second to bring those up. Um, Great. I'm coming to you today as a campaigner working with the Together for Treaty campaign, which is run by an organisation called Common Threads. Common Threads is a new First Nations led community organisation, advocacy organisation, building the power of First Nations communities across this continent. I feel really privileged to work with Common Threads in a supporting capacity as an ally. My family is English and Irish. I grew up in Lutruwita, so-called Tasmania, and now live on stolen Yagara and Turrbal country. But I'm playing, I guess, a supportive role in talking with particularly allies across the continent about the work of Common Threads and the Together for Treaty campaign. If you haven't heard of Common Threads before, I'd encourage you to check it out. We're doing a lot of work building social license and community pressure for truth telling and treaties across the continent, but also doing a lot of work in the climate justice space. So bringing together traditional owners and First Nations community members at a local, national, and global level to talk about what our responses to the climate crisis look like on this continent and how to make sure that Indigenous rights and knowledges are really at the forefront of those climate responses and what our governments are doing as well. So that's a little bit about Common Threads. Over the past few years, the Common Threads team has done a number of projects, including two big major gatherings of First Nations people from across the country. You can see a photo on the slide of the most recent gathering that was held up in Gimoy or Cairns, where folks came together post the 2023 Voice to Parliament referendum to really grapple with all of the racism that was on display throughout that referendum debate, regardless of, which viewpoint folks held within it, and where to from here in terms of building really strong campaigns and community movements that could put First Nations justice issues back on the political agenda and mobilise folks in support. And so that was kind of the precedent or the impetus for launching the Together for Treaty campaign, which is a long-term national campaign led by First Nations people and supported by allies from all walks of life, with the goal of creating the political conditions for action on truth-telling and treaties, and doing that through community organising, storytelling, media interventions, visibility, and mobilising political pressure as well. So we're at a really exciting moment in time with the first ever treaty on this continent in moving through the Parliament in the state of Victoria. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about that context, why it's so significant, but also where it's come from, and yeah, what folks can be doing wherever you might be across the continent to really uplift, local movements and organisations that are working towards treaties. So I'll share a bunch of information and then would love to have a chat with folks, hear what questions you have. And I know you're all going to be moving into some deeper conversation about this afterwards as well, which is amazing. So we're at a really historic moment in time. What I've put up on the slide are some photos of members of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, which is an elected body by and for First Nations peoples in the state of Victoria, who over many years have been working towards a treaty with the Victorian government. And just a few short weeks ago, we saw the first ever treaty legislation in this country tabled in the Victorian Parliament. So it's truly a historic moment, I suppose, in a context where Australia, so-called Australia, is the only Commonwealth country that has never had a treaty with First Peoples, but is now also, I guess, the first to be developing and negotiating treaties in a modern context. And so what can that make possible in terms of political power, representation and rights that hasn't been possible before? Wanted to talk to you a little bit more about the journey towards this moment in Victoria for those that might not be familiar or might be in other parts of the continent as well. But just to say that this has been a really long journey and process. Conversations around treaty in Victoria started almost a decade ago in 2016, obviously building on generations of advocacy and leadership by elders and communities. You know, you'll all know the Yothu Yindi song Treaty, and have seen, incredible protests for truth and treaty and land justice over many generations. This is a multi-generational struggle that is becoming closer and closer than ever to becoming a reality. So the process and community consultation started back in 2016. And then in 2019, the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria was established. So this is an elected representative body. So First Nations people across Victoria can vote for representatives of different traditional owner groups across the state, and that elected body of representatives is leading on treaty negotiations with the state of Victoria. As a part of the journey to treaty, there's also been some incredible and historic work done in terms of truth telling and grappling with the true history of colonisation in Victoria. So many of you might have heard of the work of the Yurok Justice Commission, which was the first formal truth-telling process looking into historic and ongoing injustices experienced by First Peoples in Victoria. It was established with essentially the powers of a royal commission, and so heard testimonies from First Peoples and allies across the state of Victoria, but was also able to compel evidence and documents from governments and institutions. And so I'd really encourage you, particularly if you are in Victoria, to visit the Yurok website. It's just yurok.org.au, where they've released not only a final report, but so many different resources, videos, different pieces talking to different aspects of truth telling. And there is a big focus on the theft of land and water and what that has meant for country and for communities, and also some conversations and resources around the impacts of climate change and what that means for country in Victoria as well. So the Europe Justice Commission concluded their final report and recommendations in the middle of this year, and then have essentially sort of handed over carriage to the First Peoples Assembly to take those recommendations forward and hold governments to account through the process of negotiating treaties. And as I mentioned, we're closer than ever to the first treaty becoming a reality, which is the Victorian statewide treaty. So that treaty bill and legislation just became visible to the public a few short weeks ago. So it's all online if you want to read the bill. It's actually some of the most beautiful and generous legislation that I've ever read in terms of, the vision that has been set out by the First Peoples Assembly for what treaty can mean for all Victorians being able to walk forward together. But I've just put a bit of a summary here of some of the key aspects of this treaty agreement, because essentially a treaty is an agreement between two sovereign entities, right? So it's about recognising the sovereignty of First Nations people in Victoria, but really the contents of the treaty agreement is what's negotiated based on priorities of the community. So this initial statewide treaty has a focus on self-determination and political representation, including making the First Peoples Assembly a permanent body that can make decisions on issues affecting First Peoples, and that the government must consult and engage when they are making decisions that impact First Nations people, which goes back to that simple principle of, nothing about us without us, that applies, across all of our community, whether that is, regional communities being consulted about policies that impact them, queer people being consulted and leading on decisions that impact us, right? So that kind of core principle of self-determination and setting up infrastructure and bodies and structures for, I guess, further self-determination, self-government over the long term. There's also a big focus on truth-telling and healing. So a lot of URUK's findings and resources will be embedded right through the Victorian school curriculum from prep to year 10, so that young people growing up in Victoria can learn more deeply the true history of what happened in that place, and both the harms and injustices of colonisation, but also to learn about and be proud to celebrate the resistance, the resiliency, and the cultures of First Peoples where they live. The treaty creates powers for First Peoples to hold governments to account through independent monitoring and oversight of progress on commitments across different policy areas. And it sets up resources that the community can access, including an infrastructure fund for Aboriginal community-controlled organisations to access, a self-determination fund, and other capacity-building programs. I know there's been lots of conversation about a First Peoples Institute as sort of a training organisation for, First Nations people in Victoria to build into different kind of skills and occupations in a more self-determined structure. And the treaty agreement also contains a commitment to a formal apology from the Victorian government for historic injustices that have happened. And the expectation is that that apology will be delivered sometime later this year. So that is a bit of context on the statewide treaty, but I suppose the way that the First Peoples Assembly has talked about this as well is that, it's not that there's going to be one piece of legislation and then that's it. This is really about the beginning of a treaty era, and creating the kind of scope and opportunity for subsequent treaties, including at a statewide level, but also really importantly, individual traditional owner treaties. So specific traditional owner groups can opt to negotiate their own treaties with the Victorian government that are specific to local matters in terms of their country, their lands and waters, and the priorities of their communities. So we've seen the Judjabbarung traditional owner group announce that they will be the first to start that process, which is incredibly exciting. So just to acknowledge that, there are different layers of conversations happening that allow for conversations about different issues, but also, representation and decision making at a more local level as well. So that's a bit about where the journey to treaty is at. But I wanted to speak a little bit about the political landscape surrounding this. And I know this might be a bit of a different kind of tone of conversation to other sessions that have been happening. But I guess we see our role as Common Threads as really looking at grappling with some of the political forces that movements for justice are up against, and how we can make interventions into those systems that help drive those movements forward. So I guess, obviously we're at this really interesting point in time, right, where there's these incredibly exciting and historic milestones and moments of progress, but that's also happening in the context where we're seeing really horrific rises in far right racism. We've seen, obviously neo-Nazis literally out in the street. We've seen the attacks on camp sovereignty in Victoria, and this overall climate, particularly post-referendum and with kind of rises in far-right politics across the world that racist in a bunch of ways, whether that's racist as the individuals, institutions, political parties, are just incredibly emboldened. And so there's a lot that we're up against in terms of mis and disinformation, around issues like treaty, truth telling, land justice. And so, how do we contend with all of that? So, we're in a political landscape, specifically in Victoria, where treaty legislation is expected to pass through both houses of the parliament by the end of October, with an official signing and celebration later in the year. But there's been a loss post-referendum of bipartisan support for treaty. I think it was the beginning of last year that the Liberal and National Party came out and said that they no longer supported the pathway to treaty with First Peoples. And right now we're seeing, I guess, an emboldened anti-Indigenous rights movement that is lobbying hard for the Victorian opposition to commit to repealing treaty as part of their election platform. The state election in Victoria will be held towards the end of next year. And so I guess we see a role for us and for allies in playing this sort of defensive role to celebrate the incredible steps forward that have been possible through this treaty, but also defend what has been won so that those next steps and next layers of treaty negotiations and implementation are actually possible and aren't kind of ripped up if there is a change of government in Victoria next year. Alongside that kind of lobbying from groups like Advance Australia, we've seen a significant rise in negative media and social media coverage, including people from outside of Victoria, whether that's like Jacinta Price, etc., coming out in opposition to the treaty process, which really has been a process that has had so much community input and consultation across the state. And as I said, taken nearly a decade to get here. And so it's really important that we show that treaty is widely supported, both by First Peoples and allies, and both across the state and right around the country. And it probably feels like I'm talking a lot about what is happening in Victoria, and acknowledge that not everyone here is from Victoria or connected to that part of the continent. But the reason that we think it's really important that people all over the continent and beyond are talking about this is that Victoria will set the tone for what's next. So I've put a bit of a snapshot up on the slides of the status, I guess, of different truth-telling and treaty processes in different jurisdictions across the continent. But yeah, if we don't see, I guess, really strong public support and celebration in Victoria, or if there's a circumstance in which there's a big repeal campaign next year going into the election, that is obviously going to spook governments in different parts of the country from, moving forward with treaty processes in conversation with traditional owners and First Peoples in those different parts of the continent. So it's really important that we celebrate hard at this historic moment for Victoria and really show that there is kind of community support and momentum for treaty and truth-telling more broadly across the continent. So I won't spend like heaps of time talking at you about this, but we've obviously spoken a little about what is happening in Victoria. I guess some of the other states and territories that are more progressed along the journey to treaty are New South Wales, ACT, and South Australia. So in New South Wales, treaty commissioners have recently been appointed, and they will be leading a 12-month consultation period, which has just been announced, kind of talking with First Nations people in New South Wales about treaty. The ACT government has also made a commitment to a treaty process and is at the early stages of exploring what that looks like. In South Australia, there's work underway to establish a state level voice to Parliament. And yeah, we should see kind of more in the next 12 months in terms of voice, treaty, and truth in South Australia. And then we've got states that are trickier, particularly in the post referendum context. Obviously, the referendum was about one particular question at a federal level, but I suppose there are lots of parties and governments and actors that are, taking the result as like a resounding rejection, right, of First Nations representation, treaties, rights more broadly. And that's a massive problem that we need to work against. So in Tasmania, the government there has said that they will fund truth telling, but they've walked back on their commitment to treaty. So unclear what sort of action, reparations, response from truth telling would actually result in that context. Where I am in Queensland, we had a Liberal government elected last year, and one of their first acts was to disband the Truth Telling and Healing Inquiry that was already working, and many Aboriginal communities and elders had provided testimony and evidence to this inquiry that was then just like absolutely gutted halfway through its work. And they've repealed the path to treaty legislation here as well. Similarly, in the Northern Territory, the current CLP government has no commitment to progressing treaty conversations. The WA government also has no commitment. And federally, I think, yeah, the Albanese government has been incredibly quiet on their promises to Makarrata and Truth and Treaty post the failure of the referendum. So it's quite a mixed bag across the country, but I suppose our vision is to build a really strong solidarity movement, not to be engaged in the specific conversations about the contents or the detail of treaty agreements. That is obviously for traditional owners, traditional owner groups, and First Peoples to self-determine, but to, support that principle and that process, and to make it really clear that justice and self-determination and truth-telling matters to people from all walks of life. So there's truly a role for everyone. We've just been launching the Together for Treaty campaign, starting with a focus in Victoria, but growing across the country. I've just popped on the slide a couple of photos from some of our early events, and we've just had such a huge response and so many people that want to learn more, want to get involved, which has just been incredibly heartening to see. So I thought I'd share a few kinds of actions. Obviously, these types of actions may not be for everyone, and given the work that you folks are all doing in the community organising space, in the permaculture space, there may be other things that you identify as opportunities or things that you'd be really energized to do. So we don't want to be prescriptive in any way, but really, I think the more voices that are out there in support of First Nations self-determination and truth-telling and treaty, that is just incredibly important right now. So a few suggestions of ways to show your support. If you do happen to be in Victoria, calling and emailing your local politicians. We really want to be making sure that we're mirroring back to decision makers that there is really strong public support for the treaty process at the moment. Have conversations with your neighbours, with your friends, co-workers, fellow volunteers that can educate and build support. We'd love for you to come along to one of our trainings or get more involved as a volunteer on the Together for Treaty campaign. And we'll be looking at a few opportunities over the months ahead to really mobilise at scale, particularly towards the end of the year once the treaty is signed, to really celebrate that moment and show that the community backs it in. So there's a QR code on the slide as well that will take you to our website and a list of upcoming in-person and online training events and workshops if you are curious to come and have a chat and learn more about this. And in terms of national solidarity, a few things that, yeah, we'd encourage folks to do are really just building visibility through social media, putting up a yard sign, getting a t-shirt that allows you to kind of visibilize your support for treaty and spark conversations. Having conversations, obviously, wherever you are, is, yeah, just a really important kind of foundational building block. And I think, one of the most powerful tools that we have to combat the threat of, far right misinformation and cut through kind of toxic social media algorithms is to have real conversations with real people in real life that are grounded in our shared values and the future that we want to see. Um, I've got activate your sector to support treaty, but yeah, obviously that could also look like grassroots community movements, local groups, all of the things. What does it look like to, yeah, I guess draw upon the reach and the resources you may have to spread that message in support of treaty? And we are looking to hold a big national summit in early 2026 for both First Nations people and allies across the country who want to organise in your communities on treaty. So keep an ear out for more information about that. It's going to be great. I've linked here as well with this little code. Yeah, this will take you to our website again, where you can find like downloadable resources, conversation guides, more information and materials as well, should you be interested. So, yeah, if this has like sparked, yeah, your interest and is something that you're keen to stay connected to and be a part of, you can join our little WhatsApp community where volunteers across the country are sharing plans, asking questions, keeping updated. And there's a link for that on the slide as well, where I'm just really throwing links at you today. You can follow us on social media. We're at Together for Treaty on Instagram. And if you have ideas for how we might be able to collaborate, always, yeah, keen to get connected to more movements and grassroots networks of people. So feel free to drop us a line at info@commonthreads.org.au as well. I feel like I've talked to you for quite a while, so I'm going to pause there. I don't know if there might be questions and things, but yeah, really appreciate your time. And yeah, hope this was some kind of useful context about the Together for Treaty campaign and where it's all come from.
Thank you so much, Alex. Wow, what a number of successes to celebrate. Within that, so much gone into sense making, truth telling, understanding, and really um, building the strongest case to move forward. So it's such a joy to hear within the context of the world right now and the plight for sovereignty. So thank you so much for coming in and sharing that. And yeah, basically, what an amazing time that it is right now, within a really terrible time that it is right now. But thank you for sharing that. Firstly, I want to just see if any of the attendees want to ask any questions. Open up the Q&A function. Also, if you want to raise your hand, as we did yesterday, we can bring you on to the panel to have a discussion, share any of your thoughts on this. But yeah, thank you. I think, to contextualize this within our various localizing food networks and communities, I think this is incredibly relevant to how, we structure our solidarity and how we show up. And so you spoke a little bit about how, grassroots organizations and communities can have those conversations. Can you say a little bit more about what that has looked like and how that has resulted in contribution and yeah, sort of the value of these kinds of responses?
Yeah, for sure. I think since we started the campaign, it's been pretty amazing to see the interest from community organisations and grassroots groups, and particularly like folks taking the time to reflect on like what the treaty journey means in the context of the work that they do or the issues that matter to them. And so, whether that's like folks who work in the health space, kind of telling stories and amplifying like the incredible work of Aboriginal community controlled health organisations and how treaty will put, decision making and resources more squarely in their hands to do the work that they do, or whether that's climate and environment organisations talking about the leadership of First Peoples in caring for country, and why, solidarity is important to them. I think like being able to join those dots really matters. And then, yeah, I think practically like the types of things we've been encouraging folks to do are really simple. Activities and events, whether that is a kitchen table conversation, like getting a group of 10 people together, sharing some information about the journey to treaty, sharing why it matters to you, and inviting people to kind of share questions and reflections, or whether that's something like a film screening, where, you're getting a group together, showing a First Nations film, talking about the treaty journey, and getting people to do. We've got a bunch of different calls to action and activities people can do, whether that's like writing a letter to their MP, calling their MP, posting on social media, different things like that. But yeah, I guess something that we've reflected on is like there's been just so much work by traditional owners and First Peoples that's gone into the treaty process, but like actually a lot of people don't know that it's happening. And so, yeah, I guess what is that opportunity to build visibility and awareness so that, in the case where people are coming out from, the far right of our politics and attacking that process, that there's actually a really diverse network of people that are equipped to stand up and defend it and say, no, like this is why this is really important, and sharing their personal story of why it matters to them, whether they're a First Nations person or not. So yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, we've been interrogating our food movements and local food movements in so-called Australia, and what the cultural limitations are based off of a non Indigenous sort of led future that's in there, and how
I guess,
that drastically changes where we head, and the ways in which we head in those directions. And so, yeah, we've been really trying to form, okay, well, what are movements like permaculture? What are their uses? What are their roles, of which they're, really beautiful jewels in terms of, creating sovereign agency within how people understand themselves and the systems that they belong to. But there's that disconnect of how that belongs here in this place, alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So we've been, one of the themes from a previous speaker was about what is the political formation process, and I really like the you know accessibility that this campaign has laid out. That it is just about conversations, listening more than you talk, and trying to understand other people's perspectives, and build that narrative and awareness. Um, can you paint a picture of what community uh, formation has looked like in these, and sort of, yeah, paint how what is possible in those contexts, and how people can respond to, as people who may not consider themselves to be that politically active around these issues?
yeah, for sure. So I think we've, yeah, just kind of throwing out a bunch of invitations for action and seeing where the energy is and what kinds of structures make sense. So we've held a few kind of more in-depth training days for people to come together and feel more confident and more skilled up, both like understanding the journey to treaty and how to talk about that, but also really practically like how would I go about meeting with my MP, or how would I go about organising a film screening. So we hope to do a lot more of that and have folks kind of self-organising into Together for Treaty action groups that might be sort of specific to a particular suburb or town or location, or might be people from a like-minded community that meet online or organise in other ways. But, we're also really conscious as well that There's lots of ways that people are already organised in their communities, whether that's part of an existing volunteer group, part of their union, part of a community garden. And so, yeah, like would absolutely love to see those types of networks of people, having some visibility around the Together for Treaty campaign, organising events, or just like even talking amongst themselves as a starting point about like, yeah, what that looks like and how to take action. But yeah, hopefully that it's a great question. Hopefully that sort of covers it. We're keen to be flexible and yeah, just like allow folks to contribute, get involved in ways that like are comfortable and relevant for them.
Thank you, Alex. Um, and also, you spoke about, treaty is an agreement between two sovereign entities, and that, it's so critical in reconciliation and reparations and moving forward to provide the time, space, resources for those sovereign mechanisms and institutions to be reinstated around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island communities. And then also the sovereignty of the partners, not exclusively the state or not exclusively the federal government, but it's actually embodied and lived in every ally who honours that treaty, whatever it looks like. And, you're embodying that now, sharing and amplifying this work. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about what it means to be, step forward from this current state of, you know, essentially settler occupation in so-called Australia into not obviously not Aboriginal and Torres Strait, but into that other entity, that partnership entity, and what that looks like, and how you understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've, yeah, obviously in building this campaign, had a lot of time and dialogue with the First Peoples Assembly as well, and folks who've been, yeah, really deeply involved in shaping and leading that process. And something that comes up a lot is like part of what's important about treaty is like resetting the relationship between both First Peoples and the government, but also, yeah, between First Peoples and other people who now call this place home, whatever their journey has looked like to get here. And I think, yeah, it's just been such an incredibly generous invitation in the ways that, First Peoples in Victoria are talking about this treaty as, an opportunity to come together, to walk forward together, to grapple with the injustices of our history, but to not, get stuck in that, but to focus on action and redress and justice, and how, by tackling and addressing inequality and injustice and telling the truth of that, yeah, we can move forward together with a more healthy and mature relationship and, yeah, towards the future where, First Nations young people can thrive, but non-Indigenous young people can also learn so much about, the history and the cultures and the wisdom of the lands on which they live, and how that can, at the end of the day, like really benefit everyone, and how there is so much, wisdom and knowledge that all of us can learn so much from, especially as we contend with, yeah, the climate crisis and other huge global challenges that are facing our communities. And so, yeah, I think like something, and having worked on different campaigns in the past, like I know that for a lot of people who live on this continent, like they might not have close personal relationships with many First Nations people. And I think a lot of the time people can get super nervous and held back of like, I don't want to say the wrong thing or, rah, rah, rah. But actually sometimes that just has a silencing effect in which then like people aren't saying anything. And so when there's like an attack on camp sovereignty or when there's, an attack on treaty, there aren't enough allies that are out and visible and, not only, you know, being in solidarity with First Nations people, but also like doing the work of having the conversations with the non-Indigenous people in our own lives, who might hold really uninformed or racist views or whatever the case may be. Like, actually, that's our work to do. And so, yeah, what does it look like to reflect and learn and move to a place where you're confident and able to do that? Anyway, those were a bunch of assorted musings on that question. But yeah, I think just to say, like, we want this campaign to be, yeah, something that people from all walks of life can feel a part of and take ownership in, obviously taking leadership from First Nations people. But yeah, if we're going to see the kind of scale of power redistribution and political change that is so necessary, it can't only be First Nations people for calling for that. It's
Hi, Alex. I just had a question myself, and it kind of pops into a little bit of what Guy was saying there. Of like, I know that in an Aotearoa context, they have language around like tangata whenua, like people of the land, like First Nations people, and like there's other language for people like me, like Pakeha as white, but there's also language for people who try to move towards white relationship, tangata tiriti, like people of the treaty. And I wonder with like if this goes forward, what that context could look like in this continent, but also orienting within the fact that like um, treaty, I imagine, isn't the end goal. Like treaty is a major milestone along the way, but isn't like, oh well, now we have justice has happened and now we get to put things down. Where does treaty fit within like that also that spectrum of like moving towards First Nations justice and reparations and all of that? Like, are there any other discussions about like treaty happening, but then what happens post treaty as well?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think we talk a lot about yeah, obviously the Aotearoa context and yeah, no, there's lots of work and struggle there to both like defend treaty but also push for further justice. But yeah, I think even in some of our uh, kind of messaging research work and conversations with folks, non-Indigenous people in Australia can often see that there's a recognition of Maori culture and visibility of that in Aotearoa that doesn't always exist in the same way here, and sometimes that can be like an opening point to a conversation about treaty and what that means, and yeah, what the kind of opportunities are through treaty. Not to say that the processes are like comparable, and yeah, there's obviously a lot in there, but yeah, I think and I can see like both of you are on Bundjalung country, and just thinking about yeah, my colleague and the director of Common Threads, Larissa Baldwin Roberts, who's a Witchable Wowable woman, talks about how there's and I hope she won't mind me sharing this, but like talks about how in her language there's no word for visitor, and if someone's on your country then like you're responsible for them. And so yeah, I think obviously like in different parts of the continent the conversation might be different, but yeah, like I just think there's an incredibly generous offer extended by First Nations people in these conversations about truth telling and treaty and like where we go from here. And yeah, at the end of the day, it's about, wanting people to recognize the injustices that have happened and not, yeah, not feel responsible for the actions of their ancestors, but feel responsible for the legacy of those actions and the injustices that, continue to exist and how we, dismantle those systems, right? And then the other part of what you said was also really great and has totally just slipped my mind. Can
Um,
you refresh
no
me?
worries. It was because it was a double-pronged question. Sorry. It was the like with if treaty comes through, which
Oh, yeah, yeah,
yeah, like how is that fitting within any other campaigning strategies? Just because wanting to push but not wanting to like lose, like how do you keep the momentum
yeah,
going towards First
yeah,
Nations and not have people be like, oh, we ticked the box, like, oh, now we do acknowledgements of country, now we're good. Like,
yeah.
how do we keep that going?
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think like I've obviously been really privileged to hear lots of conversations amongst First Nations campaigners in this space, particularly in Victoria, but also more broadly. And I think yeah, just I guess the analogy of in what other context would we have one decision or one piece of legislation and then be like, right, that's it. Women are sorted. We never need to like legislate or fund their services ever again, etc., etc. And so I think the way that the First Peoples Assembly in Victoria, for example, have kind of set up the treaty process is incredibly strategic in that it allows for evolution over time. So not only, yeah, specific traditional owner treaties to follow the statewide treaty, but also leave space for like further treaties to be negotiated. And obviously, in other, parts of the world, whether that's Turtle Island, like there might have been a treaty signed that was kind of specific or static to that point in time and doesn't allow for further conversations about what justice and rights and reparations look like as time goes on and as the needs and demands of communities evolve. So yeah, it's very much not the case of like there's the treaty and then that's it. Yeah, that in many places and parts of the continent, it may be that there's a series of treaty over time, as is the case in Victoria, but also that treaty can provide some foundational pieces around the relationship with the state, the aspirations of communities, but that there will always need to be further kind of struggle and accountability and action to hold governments to account on whatever they say that they're going to do, or to, potentially like further the transfer of decision making from governments and institutions back to communities. And so yeah, I think a conversation about like what is the resourcing that is required as well to sustain self-government and those types of things is a big piece in the Victorian Treaty process. Can't speak to elsewhere, but yeah, I think we see this as like a decade-long campaign to build social license and political momentum for truth-telling and treaty. But, as you all well know, like the struggle doesn't end with one decision or one piece of legislation or one win being achieved. Yeah, there's been generations of struggle to get to this point, and that will obviously continue.
Thank you. We've got a question here from Gillian. Can you talk about the relationship between truth telling and treaty? Can we do one without the other? Thanks. Thank you, Gillian.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Gillian. And yeah, I've had the privilege over the last few months to spend a lot of time with former Europe Justice Commissioner Travis Lovett, who led a lot of the truth-telling work in Victoria. And, a big conversation that's been had is like truth telling as the why for treaty in a bunch of ways. And particularly for non-Aboriginal folks, like if we don't understand the true history of what has happened on this continent and the reality of theft of land, theft of children, massacres, desecration of country, then it's very hard to understand why a treaty would be necessary or why action to address injustice would be necessary. And so, I think to me, but yeah, to plenty of folks I've spoken to, they really do go hand in hand. But also the truth telling work that's been done by Uruk, they not only documented people's lived experience and lived expertise, but made over 100 recommendations for what the Victorian state government should do to address, the injustices that have happened. And so a number of those recommendations will be carried forward, whether through the treaty process or the advocacy of different First Nations organisations. And so we learn from our history, right? And if we can't be clear-eyed in acknowledging the injustices that have happened, then how is it possible to move forward together? So, I think it's important that they sit side by side, and I think the treaty the statewide treaty in Victoria, for example, also contains a vision to establish a body that is responsible for ongoing truth telling and healing kind of processes and dialogues with community. So it's also not the case that, you know, one precedes the other and there's a hard kind of cutoff point in between. But yeah, that they're both kind of ongoing and in conversation.
Thanks for answering that, and thank you, Gillian, as well, for asking that question. Um, oh, I had a question that just popped out of my head, but I've been back. Yes. Treaty making in 2025. I think there is something so exciting about the fact that this is being proposed with the level of access to information, with the level of decolonial discourse, and the level of global awareness of equity that we have right now, rather than, you know, a lot of the other treaties that were made in, you know, warring contexts, you know, hundreds of years ago. And so, yeah, can you maybe speak to, you know, this is an opportunity to reset many things, and obviously it's a huge, you know, so much has gone into it, and it's a huge effort moving forward. But can you speak a little bit to, yeah, what, there we go. We had our first speaker, and everyone who's been continuing to come along have heard this me say this so many times to every single speaker that we've got. But shared a whakaaro, a thought from one of our leaders in Aotearoa, Moana Jackson, who's since passed, that we have to act as if, and that all of this happens as if, you know, this is the reality or this is what's happening. And I think the context that this treaty is being made within the information that's now available, within all of the, you know, um, rights that are pushing forward, um, what does this make possible, and what reality does this bring into, you know, into reality, and from the listenings and the dreams, and also the grief, and all that you've heard, can you share a little bit about the, as if, you know, on the other side of this treaty?
Yeah, it's such a beautiful question. Um, And I think, you know, with any sort of political process, right, there's the content of a document or a piece of legislation or whatever, but there's sort of what is the kind of social shift and change that enables that and then that follows it as well. And, you know, I think about like obviously the context of the just to go on a bit of a tangent, like the marriage equality debate and vote that played out in Australia. And, you know, as like awful as that was in a bunch of ways, like the yes vote kind of unlocked as well a bunch more kind of momentum and support and visibility for queer communities and folks who had, you know, homophobic views like acknowledged that they were in the minority, right, and got quieter in a bunch of ways. Not to say that there's then not like huge struggles for queer rights and trans rights that follow, but just like yeah, what does a moment like that do in terms of like public kind of consciousness of like where we're going as a country, who we are, what are the values that we share. And so I think in the same way, like you see the flip side of that in the Voice to Parliament referendum in a bunch of ways. And now this discourse of like, we voted no to welcome to countries or yada, 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 and really kind of toxic stuff. And so, yeah, I think there's the political process that happens, but what is kind of the dialogue and conversation organizing that happens around it to say like, this is really important. This is how we kind of grapple with our shared history and move forward together. The celebration of, you know, so-called Victoria leading the way, but also people organising and taking inspiration and courage from that in different parts of the continent as well. But I think, yeah, like really the message that is coming from First Nations people in Victoria when it comes to this treaty is this principle of like, we are the experts in our own lives. And like, what does it mean to really shift power and resources towards, Indigenous communities to be shaping the agenda and, the services and the solutions across housing, healthcare, education, celebration of culture, evolution of culture. But extending an invitation to non-Indigenous people to to walk forward together as well, as guests on that land. And so yeah, I think it's about yeah, also like the horrific injustices of our history being known and understood more broadly, and not kind of shouldered by First Nations people alone, and kind of, denied or minimized by others. Like, what is the kind of cultural shift that is possible when we acknowledge that history, but also acknowledge, 60,000 years plus of wisdom and 200 years plus of staunch resistance, and resiliency. So that's what comes to mind for me, but I think everyone would have a different answer, and that's part of what is.
Thank you, Alex. So we're about to round out the hour, and just to contextualize for people who may have come in late, our initial speaker, Keitha Tai Young, was unfortunately unable to come in this for this first session. So we're actually going to have a double barreled treaty session where and next the next hour we're actually going to talk about what we do here at Permaqueer and sort of sense make what contributions and what organizing efforts look like for us. And we would also love if people felt brave enough to come in and jump on the panel and talk about what that might look like for you. And you may not need to have formed ideas or understand what the strategy is. You might just, it could be a place that we can workshop and sense make these questions together. But after all, this program is called Permaculture is Political, and we do want to be accountable to what these movements are. And while I do really appreciate the the openness to meeting communities where they're at and how critical and necessary it is for it to be self-determined by communities in the way that they want to. This is also really important, and it is really critical that we do show the support so that this can continue forward, and change that narrative and move that treaty. So a gentle ask for bravery from everyone as we move through to the next session. And Alex, thank you so much for your time with us today. Thank you for the solidarity and all of the work that you've done, and our thanks through you to Common Threads, to the Europe Truth Telling body, to the First Nations, First Peoples Assembly, and to all of the bodies that have put in so much tireless effort for this to emerge now here today as it is, and to continue in the ways that it does all across Victoria and the various different places. It's a, absolutely no small feat. And so please, yeah, if appropriate, pass on our gratitude to all of the mob that have led this, and acknowledging those that aren't here today as well, through this intergenerational effort at finding justice and treaty. But thank you so much for your time. I'm not sure if you have the time to stick around with us for the chats afterwards, but thank you so much for coming along.
Thank you for having me.